I never know how to start my lectures here. This is the third time I've had a chance to give this particular lecture in the last 2 weeks. And let's see, 2 weeks ago it was to the church at Broken Arrow, and then later that week it was at the campus of OSU IT in Okmulgee to some college students. And here is, again, it'll sound totally different, I'm sure, than the previous 2 times, but to a room of very familiar faces, unlike those previous 2. To know virtually everyone in the room actually is very pleasant to me. So thank you for allowing me to come back and to be here and to participate in this particular study. Experience is something you can't purchase, and the years of experience I had here with the Barnes Church of Christ have been of priceless value to me. What we're going to look at tonight is the question of, does God exist? And if you take a look at the lectureship book, we were asked to turn in a full manuscript, and the manuscript has way more information than I could possibly cover in the next 40 minutes or the next, if I have this in my hand, it means I can also change how much time I have, but I won't do that. Way more information than I could possibly get to in the amount of time I have. Each one of the topics, of the 12 topics I want to talk about tonight, could individually take up their own lecture or their own lectureship. There are a lot of material there, a wealth of information. So what I'm going to try to do tonight is just give you a teaser, a taste of what's available in this area of study. So in the culture we currently live in, modernism has successfully tossed out the authority of the church and of Scripture in the common culture, and postmodernism has tossed out modernism. And so now we kind of have a culture where the people who we encounter are not sure who to trust or who to ask or how to think or how to arrive at the most difficult questions of life. We live in an age where, I read it on the internet, is a statement of trust rather than of incredulity. That's someplace, well, I read it on the internet, it must be true. And it's a different way of gathering information than you may have grown up learning. Depending on your own age, you may have grown up at a time where people you encountered basically believed that there is a God and that the Scriptures speak of His Word. And so we argued about how to read the Bible. But today we're in a different position. The battle line has moved, and if we keep asking that question over and over again, we're going to find ourselves very irrelevant to the question that's being asked, which is whether we can know there is a God or not, and whether the Scripture has anything to say about Him. So what we want to look at then are 12 different approaches. Why 12 approaches? Well, because I have no idea what you're willing to offer me in terms of evidence. Every person you meet today has a different way of coming to know truth, has a different set of assumptions about how to gather evidence and make decisions. Nothing is taken for granted. And so because of that, we've got to have a lot of options at our disposal to talk to the people we encounter. Even those of you in this room. I mean, I assume kind of in a church setting, a lot of you believe in God. I would gather that. However, that's not for granted to be the case. And some of you may have your own doubts. And I don't know what you're willing to grant me in terms of evidence. Aristotle said, all instruction given or received by way of argument proceeds from pre-existent knowledge. And what he means by that is you have to know something to know something. You have to have a base of information to start with in order to argue to wherever you're headed. And in the world we live in, we don't know what information is going to be allowed. Tonight, my lesson has essentially no Scripture in it because a lot of the people you're talking to will not be allowing Scripture into the discussion. When you quote Scripture, they're going to assume that you've just cheated in some way because that's not allowed. It's a sign of your ignorance that you would even mention such a book as that. So the challenge we have is in determining the existence of God is that it requires a person to first determine what evidence is admissible. And what I want to do is give you 12 different approaches to that particular question. 12 different ways to get there, because I am convinced there is nowhere you could possibly be from which you could not launch and find the God of the Bible, the God of the universe, the God revealed in Jesus Christ. There's no wrong starting place. There might be wrong first steps, there might be lots of wrong steps along the way, but there's no wrong starting place. Anywhere a person is a place that's good enough to begin with. We just have to have different approaches for how to deal with this particular question. So here's 12. Somebody asked me the other day, why 12? There's 12 because I don't have 13, and because in 40 minutes there's no way I can really cover 12, but we'll do what we can. The first possible approach we should be acquainted with is to question the very tenet of the evidence that people allow and don't allow, as I just mentioned a moment ago. W. Clay Clifford said, "It is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence." He didn't say that yesterday. He said that a century and a half ago. This isn't a new idea. His claim is that it's really morally wrong to believe on insufficient evidence. And the new atheist, names like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Hitchens, and Daniel Dennett, all best-selling authors on the question of God and of atheism, will use this kind of reasoning to say if you don't have evidence, and they tell you what evidence is and what counts and what doesn't count, if you don't have the evidence they're willing to admit, in particular scientific evidence, then you're in the wrong for even asserting that you know anything. However, this statement from Clifford is what in philosophy is called an incoherent statement, which means that if it's true, it's actually false. I know that will run your day, a statement that's true if it's false, or false if it's true. But the problem is, how does Clifford know that it's wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence? Clifford has insufficient evidence for the claim that it's wrong to believe anything on insufficient evidence. Well, why would you believe that? That's a moral statement. That's not a scientific question. The pillows are red. That's a question of experience and senses, and I can look at it and examine it. But to say something is wrong, well, that's a moral statement. So how does he know that? Why would we conclude that it's wrong to believe something without any kind of evidence that you're willing to accept? In fact, in more modern times, probably the brightest philosopher in the Christian world in the last 100 years, Alvin Plantinga, has really challenged this notion by saying, you know, we just don't think that way. In everyday life, we don't operate under that rule, ever. How do you know who your parents are? Well, there is a scientific test you could do for that. I'm betting most of you haven't done it. Well, it's wrong for you to believe that your parents are your parents because you haven't had the scientific... No, we don't tell kids that in kindergarten. We don't say, how dare you believe in your parents as real people because you haven't had a paternity test done. No, we go through life quite often with some pretty basic assumptions. How many of you have been to Hawaii? I know some of you have, right? Okay, so you've been to Hawaii. How do you know that you've been to Hawaii? Well, because when I got there, the pilot said, "Welcome to Hawaii." What does that matter? Welcome to Hawaii. Well, nobody's convinced, right? I don't think any of you want to pay me for the price of admittance, right? Well, there was a sign. When I got off the airplane, there was a sign that said, "Welcome to Hawaii." I could put a sign up here and it would say, "Welcome to Hawaii." How did you know that you were actually in Hawaii and that pilot didn't just like fly around for a while and drop you down at Lake Eufaula and charge you a lot of money? I mean, how do you actually know that? Did you do a geological survey? Did you get out lots of devices and scientific instruments and consult? No, you didn't do any of that. You trusted somebody who said, "Welcome to Hawaii," and you were satisfied with that. Our point is, there are lots of things that you know, and I mean know in the real sense, in everyday existence, that you don't have scientific evidence for, that you would never even ask for scientific evidence for. If you went around asking for scientific evidence, you'd be a little bit strange. Plantinga's favorite example is the existence of other people's minds. Not brains. I can cut your head open and find the gray stuff. But how do I know you have a mind? By definition, the only awareness or consciousness I could possibly experience is my own. So how do I know you have one? How do I know that when you say you feel pain, it feels like when I feel pain? Or when you say you're happy, it feels like when I feel I'm happy? How do I know? There are a very small number of people who actually worry about that at night. There's a philosophy joke about the professor who believed he was the only real person and everybody else was fake. And his students would also often say, "We really worry about that professor. When he goes, we all go," right? Because he's the only one who's real. And what do? But there's not a lot of people who actually lose any sleep over that, okay? We believe it's a properly basic belief that your mind exists, that I had breakfast this morning, that the universe is older than 5 minutes, that Judy's been to Hawaii. We believe that on a regular basis, information like that. And it's perfectly reasonable. Nobody questions your sanity. So the point is, could it be, if there is a God, that that's a fact that's big enough and obvious enough, ingrained into the universe, that it might be okay to believe it in the same way you believe your parents are your parents? That you don't have to have any of the kind of evidence that some of these guys ask for, because it's just not necessary. That's entirely possible. If you don't like that argument, that's fine. I've got more slides. Number two is the cosmological argument. This is a very, very old argument. You can find it in ancient Jewish writings. You can find it in ancient Christian writings. You can find it in ancient Islamic writings. One of the most notable pronouncements of it today is by a guy named William Lane Craig, who actually, his articulation of it comes from the Islamic tradition, is the way he phrases it. And the argument kind of runs like this. Cosmological comes from the Greek cosmos. So we're talking about the arrangement of the universe, its sense of existence and how it comes to be. Whatever has a beginning of existence must have a cause. The universe began to exist, so the universe must have been caused to exist. We could argue about the arrangement of verbs, but basically that's a pretty straightforward argument. If the first two premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. So let's look at the first two premises. Number one, whatever has a beginning of existence must have a cause. How do we know that's true? Well, everyday human experience seems to indicate that it is the case. When you're walking down the street, you don't see a rabbit kind of pop into existence. Now, you might have gone to the magic show and you can pull a rabbit out of the hat, but what we're talking about here is the rabbit with no hat, right? There's no hat, there's no trick, there's no nothing, rabbits, right? Or atoms, or whatever you want to talk about. It's pretty generally understood in common human experience. Things don't pop into existence without cause. In the scientific world, we could appeal to rules of thermodynamics or the absolute rules of creation and destruction of matter. That there are rules and reasons to believe that things that have a beginning have a reason for that beginning. Because things don't just happen. They have causes. What about the second point? The universe began to exist. That's a fairly new concept, actually, in science. Aristotle was happy to say maybe the universe has always been here. Aristotle agreed with point one. He said, if you've got motion, motion begets motion. And so if you've got motion, you've got to have a first mover, a prime mover, an unmoved mover, right? But his out was to say, well, maybe the universe has just always been here, and so we don't have to worry about it. Just causes behind causes behind causes, and it's just always been around. Would it surprise you to know that science is really on our side right now on this particular issue? We're so short-sighted about the history of science that we miss this sometimes. Up until the 1800s, it was very common for people to believe that maybe the universe had just always been here. But then science starts developing theories of thermodynamics, of how heat engine works and how mechanical energy is transferred. We start getting more sophisticated laws of gravity and relativity in the early part of the 1900s. We get to a better sense of the universe, and what we know as the Big Bang cosmology was a revolution not because of its age, that's some of the stuff we talk about today. What was revolutionary about it was that it claimed the universe actually had a start. It came not from an atheistic perspective. The originator of the Big Bang model was a Jesuit priest who was arguing from religious grounds that the universe couldn't have always been here because we know better than that. My Bible tells me so. So based on that, the science followed out of it. Lemaitre argued that, the universe does have a beginning, and modern science agrees. Now here's the best part. All those contentious issues about how old is the universe or how did it get here, we can take all that and put it in a box and set it aside and forget about it for this question. Because it doesn't matter if it's 6 weeks or 13.8 billion years, did the universe begin to exist? And the answer is, well, everybody says that it does. Science, religion, everybody's in agreement on that point. And so we're forced to that final conclusion that the universe must have been caused to exist. What kind of cause are we talking about? It can't be something in the universe, right? It can't be something that we're trying to get to a cause, causing the cause, right? That doesn't work. It has to be something that is above and beyond what we're trying to explain. And that points to a being, a personal being, a being with will and choice, because that's how things happen. If I was a very daring person, I would take something off the podium and throw it into the audience and say, lawsuit would follow, so I won't. But I would say, all right, how did that come about? Okay? Personal will and personality causes things to happen. And outside of just the mechanical working out of natural rules, personality is the only other thing we know, which points to the idea that maybe there's a person back there who caused all these things to exist. But you don't like that one. That's okay. I've got number 3. Number 3 is the teleological argument. The cosmological asks about where did it all come from. The teleological, telos in Greek, has the idea of an end or a purpose or an accomplished thing, a thing brought to maturity. So the teleological argument asks the question, what is it doing and what is it accomplishing? If reality exhibits evidence of purpose and intent, and that purposeful features is very unlikely to have arisen through random or unguided causes, then it is reasonable to conclude that this intent is the result of a purposeful choice to embed the intent in reality. And that's pretty dense, but that's the famous example of this from the 1800s comes from a guy named William Paley, who used the metaphor of a stopwatch or a pocket watch. Okay, so you're walking down on the beach and you got your seashells and your sand, and you stumble across a pocket watch, and you look at it, and you intuitively, your brain, without asking your permission, does the math. And it looks at the symmetry of the object, the mechanical nature of the object, the ability it has to tell precise time, and the arrangement of the numbers in the face, the precision of the gears inside the little watch. And you come to the conclusion, without thinking really very much about it, that this item is the result of some kind of intent. It has a function. It didn't get there naturally. Somebody created this object and invested in it purpose and intent. They made it to do something. So what Paley would ask us to do is just now apply that to what you see in the world around you. Does your life have purpose or intent? On an atheistic scheme, it does not. Do the mechanical parts of your body have purpose and intent and function? There are some great, and these are blessings from God, great advances being made in the modern field of prosthetics right now, with a lot of our soldiers coming home from overseas. There's a lot of things available now that weren't available just a year or two ago. It's incredible work. But the finest prosthetic still really dims in comparison to the things your fingers do on a regular basis, that you can interpret the sensation of heat. Your eyes are an incredible device. From an astronomy background, we always marvel at what good optics our eyes have, and do it so intuitively that I can look here and focus on this object, and then without really even thinking about it or doing the trigonometry or anything, I can focus on the object at the back of the room, and the muscles in the eye just go ahead and adjust for that. And all the while I'm blinking to keep things out of my eye, and I'm adjusting the opening to allow the right amount of light in. So if you turn too much on, I'll adjust. If you turn too much down, I adjust. Now all that's functioning. And so what Paley's doing in the 1800s is saying, just take a look at that. That's kind of impressive. It has function. It has intent. Why can't we recognize the creator of that function in those things? In more modern times, this particular discussion has been developed into what's called the intelligent design movement, or sometimes you'll hear the phrase irreducible complexity. Michael Behe is probably the most popular author in this field, and here's what he says about what he describes as irreducible complexity. An irreducibly complex system cannot be produced directly, that is, by continuously improving the initial function, which continues to work by the same mechanism, by slight successive modifications of a precursor system, because any precursor to an irreducibly complex system that is missing a part is by definition non-functional. I love that phrase about irreducible complexity because it is itself irreducibly complex. I couldn't find any part of that to leave out, and it's just really hard to read. But if you stare at it a long time and think about what it means to be irreducibly complex, what he's trying to say is the more we know about biology, the more we know about what's going on the cellular level, the more impressed we are by the intense design and complexity of the universe, not less. Remember, Darwin, for all of his cleverness, existed in a vacuum of knowledge. Darwin exists before the discovery of DNA, before the discovery of germs, before the Human Genome Project. And the amount of information available to him is mostly in terms of breeding. I mean, we have information about how to breed animals and so forth, and that kind of hereditary information. But now that we look at a different layer of the scheme of life, it's incredible information. One example I'll just throw out there. should have put a picture in here, that would have been good, is the flagellar motor. The flagellar motor is a little device built into certain single-celled organisms. It's a little filament, the flagellum, that comes out of the back of the single cell. And it spins at a rate of hundreds of thousands of RPMs. If you zoom in with a really expensive microscope device, you can take a look at the internal working of this device, really in modern times for the first time, and see how it works. And it looks just like an outboard motor. I mean, it's incredibly sophisticated. It has a U-joint, it has ball bearings, it has gears. It can stop on a dime, it can reverse and alter motion, and all of those things have to work together or the device doesn't work at all. That is to say, if you take out the ball bearings and gears, you just have a filament that doesn't spin. Okay? A filament attached to a cell that doesn't spin is called an anchor. That doesn't make you more fit to exist, it makes you less fit to exist. If you take the U-joint out and everything else works but there's no U-joint, then it only goes forward and all the little germs are at the edge of the petri dish trying to get out because they can't turn, right? That it has no sense of direction. Or if you take it all out and you just have the opening in the cell, I mean, how well do you function with an extra hole in your head? Holes in the cell membrane are not productive. You have to have all the parts there together at the same time functioning, or it's actually a detriment to the life of the cell. And so we have little structures like that on the cellular level of life that we've only learned about in modern times that really reinforce Paley's idea. Paley didn't have any idea how right he was, that there is really something built into life that is incredible in its complexity. But if you're not convinced by that, that's fine. I'm not a life science guy, so I always feel weird giving Behe's argument. He's got some books, you can read them. I'm more convinced by an argument that's called fine-tuning. Mostly I'm convinced because it deals with physics and not biology, and biology's gross. So physics, we get to talk about the fine-tuning of the universe, and let me tell you what we mean by fine-tuning. Imagine a tree in your backyard, and underneath the tree are some limbs. The limbs are different sizes, different shape, kind of bent in different directions. You look at the limbs and you say, okay, these are a random assortment of limbs that fell out of the tree. Okay, go back the next week. Pile of limbs underneath the same tree, but this time they're all exactly the same length. And all the edges are smooth. Well, nobody thinks this fell out of my tree. You look at the comparative similarity of the length of the branches and the smoothness of the edge, and you immediately and intuitively assume someone cut this branch. Someone has cut these to length. Someone's making firewood, okay? Now let's come back a week later, and now instead of a small pile of cut limbs, there's 5,000 2x4s. They are all exactly the same, well, I mean, 2x4s, but they're as close as 2x4s get to being exactly the same length, and they're all look about alike, and they're stacked up very neatly. The person who says, well, they could have fell out of that tree and kind of landed that way, is not really thinking coherently. It's in the fine-tuning, the repeated precision that our mind intuitively does the math without asking us, and comes to the conclusion that something is going on here that required intentionality. Something did this on purpose. 2x4s don't fall out of trees. Well, the universe is built on a lot of fine-tuning that really boggles the mind. I told you this is one of my favorite arguments, but it's hard for me to communicate because the math is so staggering, I don't have any really good metaphors to help you with how to get it, but I'm going to try. I'm going to take one example, and that's a constant called big G. Big G is the gravitational constant. It's supposed to be the same everywhere, as far as we can tell, whether you're in San Diego or Oklahoma City or Mars or Alpha Centauri or Andromeda. It doesn't matter where you are in the universe. Big G had better be big G. That's what it's got to be. It's the gravitational constant. For those of you that are preparing for the test at the end of the lecture, it's 6.673 times 10 to the negative 11th meters cubed over kilograms second squared, as we all know and love. Repeat in unison now. 6.6, no, look at that. This number is an incredibly precise number. To quote William Lane Craig, that's a typo, it's supposed to be William Lane Craig. If this constant varied by just 1 in 10 to the 60th parts, none of us would exist. And what he means by that is not just life wouldn't exist, complex chemistry doesn't exist if you change big G by 10 to the 60th parts. Well, that's great, Ben. What's 10 to the 60th? What does that even mean? So let me try. It's difficult, but let me try to kind of give us a metaphor. Imagine a dial, and this is the big G dial, and it's got 10 marks on it, okay? And you can select any of those marks, 1 through 10. And you can turn it and set G. That's 1 in 10 to the first power. Now I'm going to take one of those subdivisions, 1, and subdivide it into 10 more pieces. So now if I did that all the way around, instead of 10 dashes, I'd now have 100 dashes, which is 10 to the second power. Now if I take one of those dashes and subdivide it 10 more times, I've now got 1,000 dashes on my dial, or 10 to the third power. Keep doing this 57 more times. Okay? 57 more subdivisions, 60 sets of subdivisions by 10. And that is the degree of precision that dial has to be set to allow for any kind of complex chemistry to exist at all. And this is great, because the more you believe in the Big Bang model of the universe, the more this is true. Right? The Big Bang is not an out to this. You can't say, oh, it's all right, we've got another plan. No, this is a result of Big Bang chemistry and physics. That if the Big Bang is true, this has to follow. You have to have that precise initial condition at the instant of the Big Bang. That number has to be fixed to that precise number, or none of it works and there is no universe of any substance. It's an incredibly precise number. It's a silly number. I mean, I'm making metaphors here with dials that we can't even imagine the level of precision involved in that. Antony Flew was one of the most famous atheists of the last century. On my shelf right now is a book titled Atheistic Humanism by Antony Flew. I mean, he was the guy making the arguments for atheism. Towards the end of his life, he converted to a form of theism. And when asked why the change, he cited this kind of information. He says, it's the fine-tuning of the universe. We shouldn't exist. We shouldn't be here. There is no way you can do the math and get that many constants and that many variables and that many particles dialed to that degree of precision constantly and perfectly in a way that allows us to be here. And here we are. And that staggered Flew, and it should stagger us. But even on top of that, to go one more layer down, we're almost done with math, I promise. One more layer down into the nature of the universe is the regularity of the universe and the success of mathematics. The fact that we can study it at all is a strange thing. Math is an abstraction. It's an abstract idea. You've all seen Star Wars, and I know in Star Wars it starts and there's letters like floating through space. You all realize there's no letters actually floating through space, right? Okay, that doesn't exist. I think some people think that about math, that maybe out there past the moon is the number 2 kind of floating yellow through space, and 2 plus 2 equals 4 is over there somewhere. No, math is an abstraction. It's a powerful abstraction, but that's the point. Why is an abstraction like numbers and mathematical formula and rules and products and so forth, why do they work so well? Why can I say the force due to gravity is big G times mass over r squared? Why can I say that and it works every time? Whether you're shooting a missile or dropping an apple, the apple never goes up. Just one time, we'd really like that apple to go up and just, make sense of it all, right? But it doesn't. For some reason, the math always works. And the more we learn about physics, the more true it becomes. Werner Heisenberg is one of the fathers of modern quantum physics, and Einstein, you probably know, is the father of modern relativity. And they were having a discussion about their discoveries at one point. And here's what Heisenberg says to Einstein. If nature leads us to mathematical forms of great simplicity and beauty, by forms, I'm referring to coherent systems of hypotheses and axioms, etc., to forms that no one has previously encountered. We cannot help thinking that they are true, that they reveal a genuine feature of nature. You must have felt this too, the almost frightening simplicity and wholeness of the relationships which nature suddenly spreads out before us and for which none of us was in the least prepared. Do you hear the emotional language into that statement? Now, this is a scientific person, a mathematical person, a cold Spock kind of person, we'd like to think, and he's speaking in emotional language. What is he telling us? I saw something and it scared me. that nature has a mathematical beauty to it. He pulled back the curtain and he was shocked by what he saw. And he says to Einstein, "You must have seen it too." And he did. They asked Einstein once, what if the universe isn't like you think it is? He says, "I pity a God who would make a universe any other way." And his point was that his system of rules were beautiful, and that's how he knew they were true. But they had an inherent sense to them. And yet, why is it that this abstraction of mathematics works so well? We tend to forget that it doesn't have to be that way. We could wake up to new physics every morning, but we don't. And that's strange, and we ought to ponder it. Number 7, I'm going to run through this one very fast. The ontological argument is the ultimate acquired taste. There are some foods you have to learn to like. The ontological argument is that food. Okay? Anselm developed it in the 11th century in the form of a prayer. If you're convinced by it, it's the ultimate proof. If you're not, you're ready for me to move on. But here's what he said. "Even the fool is convinced that something exists in the understanding, at least, than which nothing greater can be conceived. For when he hears of this, he understands it, and whatever is understood exists in the understanding. And assuredly that than which nothing greater can be conceived cannot exist in the understanding alone." Let me parse that just a moment. What is he trying to say? He's saying, can you imagine something greater than which nothing can be imagined? A greatest possible being. Okay? Yeah, I can imagine a greatest possible being. He says, okay. Now, is it greater to exist or not exist? Well, it's greater to exist. Well, if your greatest possible being doesn't exist, he's not greatest yet, so keep working on it. If your greatest possible being does exist, ta-da, we can move on. And so it's a difficult argument because it feels like there's a slippery word game going on, but it's been revitalized in recent years. Again, to mention, I'm not trying to name drop, but just kind of give you information for research purposes if you're curious and want to Google it. Alvin Plantinga has developed a very sophisticated philosophical rendition of this argument. It's pretty compelling, and basically it is it possible that God exists? Is it possible that there is a being who can exist who cannot not exist? Is that a possibility? And it's worth pondering. Don't like that one? That's okay. We've got more. Number 8, the human intellect argument. Why is it that we're able to sit in this room in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and ask deep questions about the universe in the first place? How is it we're even capable of that? The great search of modern technology is artificial intelligence. In the atheistic scheme, that's what we are. We're the universe thinking about itself. Humans are just stardust. Humans are just matter in motion. And yet we write poetry, we do art, create beautiful music, ask deep questions about the meaning of life, think about things. Paul Davies, professor of mathematical physics, says, "We human beings are able to grasp at least some of nature's secrets. We have cracked part of the cosmic code." Why this should be, just why Homo sapiens should carry the spark of rationality that provides the key to the universe, is deep enigma. We who are children of the universe, animated stardust, can nevertheless reflect on the nature of that same universe, even to the extent of glimpsing the rules on which it runs. How we have become linked into this cosmic dimension is a mystery, yet the linkage cannot be denied. If you're atheistic and your mind is a byproduct of random processes, there's no reason to trust your mind. Dogs have minds. They have random electrical impulses going through their minds. And yet I don't trust what a dog says about morality or ethics. If a dog ever tells me anything about morality and ethics, I'm not going to trust my own mind either, right? There's something very, very wrong in that scenario. So why is it we trust our minds? And why is it that our minds keep working all the time and we can do beautiful things that have no survival value? I'm going to run out of time, but let me just give you an example. Imagine a perfect, white, undisturbed, snowy field. Perfect and pristine. 2 cavemen walk through this field. Caveman number 1 says, "Wow, this is beautiful," and he stares at it. And then he freezes to death. Caveman number 2 says, "I don't care about beauty." He goes into his cave and he gets warm. Which one has more survival value? There's no reason to appreciate beauty. If you stand down a cliff and you stare at the mountain vista and you say, "Wow, this is beautiful," you're just as likely to fall off the cliff. But if you don't appreciate beauty, you sit down below and you don't care. And yet the human mind, for no good reason, nothing to do with procreation or shelter or any of the things that we're supposed to be doing, hunting, gathering, and whatnot, we appreciate a good sonnet. And that fact is a stubborn fact that I think we have to struggle with without God. However, my favorite of favorite arguments is actually one that's much simpler than these that have gone before, and it's the moral argument. The moral argument works like this. Pick anything that you believe is wrong. It doesn't even matter what it is. It doesn't even matter if you're right. There's at least one person in this room who thinks it's immoral for me to wear a bow tie. I think that's silly, but we can go with it. It doesn't matter what you believe, right? The point is, do you believe there is such a thing as something that's actually totally every time wrong? And most people do. Just once in my life have I met someone who really affirmed there was no absolute right and wrong. I said, so it wouldn't be wrong for me to take your sandwich right now and eat it? He said, well, not absolutely. I ate a sandwich. And he was not happy with the result. There's not a lot of people, right, who really live by that system of rules that would let you take their sandwich without consequence. We all say there's things that are wrong. So an example I could put up, rape is wrong. Most people will go that far with you, right? There's not a lot of people, there is not a pro-rape party in American politics. Most people are willing to say rape is wrong. So here's the big, giant, enormous, earth-shattering question. Why? Now, I don't mean why do you think it's wrong? And I don't mean why do we act like it's wrong? I'm asking, why is it actually wrong? And why is there such a thing as wrong? There's a great YouTube clip of a fairly prominent atheistic scholar, and he has the misfortune of being on stage between Ravi Zacharias and William Lane Craig, who are Christian apologists, and he's complaining about the Bible, and he says, I tell you why you don't believe in the Bible, because of all the slavery in the Bible. That's just barbaric slavery in the Bible. So William Lane Craig interrupts him and says, so you believe that slavery is wrong? Well, yes, of course slavery is wrong. And he says, why? And this guy with the PhD stammers around that question for 5 more minutes until they give up. The audience that starts out very skeptical is actually laughing out loud by the end of the clip because the guy is so obviously lost in his own thoughts that he is convinced that the Bible is silly because slavery is wrong, and he cannot convince himself of a full sentence, an English sentence with a subject and a verb that explains why it would actually be wrong. Not without God. Subjectively wrong. I don't like slavery. I don't want to be a slave. But objectively, actually wrong was a problem for him. And I think this is a problem a lot of folks haven't really pondered. C.S. Lewis started out as an atheist and then moved to belief in God. Said it like this. He said, my argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? If the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I, who was supposed to be part of the show, find myself in such violent reaction against it? If I'm part of the senseless mayhem of the universe, why do I care that rape is wrong? Why would I believe that? One mammal biped rapes or has intercourse. Let's take the word rape out of it. A mammal biped has intercourse forcefully and degradingly with another mammal biped on a little bitty continent, on a little bitty planet, on a little bitty solar system, in a little bitty galaxy, in a universe that doesn't care. Or to quote Richard Dawkins, he's just dancing to the tune of his DNA. Who cares? On the atheistic scheme, there's not a reason to care. And yet in our experience, in human experience of life, we do care. Everybody believes in right and wrong. We don't agree on what they are. But essentially everyone believes that there is such a thing. And oddly enough, most of us don't believe we're doing it right. That's the funny thing. If I were making up morality, I would at least pick the stuff I'm already doing. And yet most of us look at our lives, atheists look at their lives, and they'll say there are things they've done that they regret. They'll look back and say there's things about the world that are not right. Why do we have this sense? Why do 5-year-olds on the playground playing a game say it's not fair? They've never taken a class in American jurisprudence. They don't understand game theory. Why do they think it's not fair? Because they come with a sense of this, and they know when it's wrong. Number 10 is the resurrection argument. Time is going to really get away from me, so let me just quickly move through this. Christianity can make this argument and nobody else can, which is one of the reasons I like it. Could there be an event such that if you could know it happened, it would prove without doubt that God existed? If you answer that question and say no, you've kind of tipped your hand. Nothing could ever happen that would convince me God exists is a pretty significant bias, right? And so most people have to at least admit, well, yeah, I guess God could do something. What could that be? Well, if there's one fact that science has always agreed on, science changes from era to era and we make up our minds and we put it back. One thing that science has always agreed on: everybody dies, the dead stay dead. That is the universal fact of human experience to which every cemetery and graveyard bears testimony. Everybody dies, the dead stay dead. Until a small group of people in the first century said, except this one guy who didn't. Jesus of Nazareth, we saw him die, and then we saw him after. We went to his tomb, and he wasn't there. And Peter gets up and preaches a sermon making that claim, not to barbarians who didn't know any better, but to perfectly rational people who know the dead stay dead. And 3,000 people within walking distance of the tomb want to be immersed in water to reenact the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That's a powerful fact. If that happened, what would that force us to believe? It's worth asking. Number 11, just moving very quickly, is the possibility of internal experience. John Calvin wrote of what he called the sensus divinitatis, which is the sense of divinity that resides in every human. He said even false religion proves that there's a God, because all of us have this God-shaped hole in our heart that we're trying to fill. Human beings sense the divine and don't know what to do about it. If humans have a sense of the divine, or maybe an inexplicable desire for religion, then this feature of human history is easily explained by classical theism, but humanity has a God-shaped hole in its heart that's difficult to explain without it. Finally, last argument, and I saved the best for last, if anybody cares. I never saved myself enough time for it, but I did save the best for last. One of the great evangelical theologians of the last century, Karl Barth, wrote, "Theology had first to renounce all apologetics or external guarantees of its position within the environment of other sciences, for it will always stand on the firmest ground when it simply acts according to the law of its own being." There's a lot of ways to interpret Barth's statement. Like all of Barth's statements, they're perfectly confusing. But the way I choose to interpret this particular statement is this. Barth's point is, the best argument for the existence of God is not ever going to be something we say or reason out. It is going to be the church being the church. Jesus of Nazareth is the perfect revelation of God, and the people that knew him came to know God in a way that no one had ever known God before. The church is the body of Christ and lives out the purpose of Christ in this world. It's Christians that send relief to the needy after a hurricane. It's Christians who go in and pull out babies out of dumpsters when nobody else wants them. It's Christians who build hospitals and help the sick and infirm. That life is itself a kind of evidence, the church being the church, that such a thing could exist. I'll give you one example and then I'll quit because I really am out of time. This Sunday, we're having Tim Piles from Broken Arrow come over to our church at Glenpool, and he's going to be talking about how to help families with special needs children. Let me give you just a quick comparison. Richard Dawkins very recently was asked a question about, on the interwebs, had made some kind of statement about children being born with Down syndrome. And Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist, the greatest atheist of our time, said, "Abort and try again." The atheistic scheme looks at a person who is marginalized in society and voiceless and sees them as broken DNA, genes that need to be purged for the betterment of humanity. The church looks at the same person and sees what's called imago Dei, the image of God, a life of value and of meaning. Those two differences matter. They're not unimportant consequences. The church living out its belief in God is itself a proof for God's existence. So if I have to conclude this lecture, and apparently I do, my conclusion would be this: be better Christians, because that's when people are going to start believing in God. Appreciate your time.